Welcome back, everyone, to our third and final installment reacting to Lemmino's series on, well, it's just one video on Jack the Ripper. We're going to dive into his presentation of some of the most common suspects today. I will offer my own thoughts on the suspects that he presents, which I don't know who they're going to be, and then any that I think are major suspects that should be discussed that are not mentioned in this video, I'll mention myself. With that in mind, just a couple of things. Number one, some of you have been commenting on the previous two videos that there are spots where the sound kind of gets muffled and sounds a little off, and there's a reason for that. There are copyright issues with some of the music that's being used in this series, and so when I upload the video, it gives me the option. I can either just mute out that entire section, all sound, delete the section, or have YouTube kind of go in and muffle the music, but try to keep the rest of it. So if you notice there are spots where that happens, that is why, and I won't know until I upload this video where those spots are. So if that happens, rest assured I'm aware of it. Also, we talked yesterday briefly about the women and how it's important for us to remember that these were human beings who had lives and who had stories, not just victims of a nameless killer. And with that in mind, I found a video that I was watching today that I really enjoyed, and I'm going to put the link in the description to it below. It's by one of the Jack the Ripper tours over in London, and they give a little bit more of the background. They visit each of the grave sites and give a little bit more of the background into the women, as well as things like who attended their funeral, what happened with their funeral, who identified the body, things like that. So a little bit more information I thought was really worth your time. So check it out if you would. The link's in the description. Let's go ahead and dive in, starting with Chapter 7.
Following the murder of Mary Ann Nichols, a rumor began to circulate that someone called Leather Apron was in the habit of abusing prostitutes. The name quickly made its way into the press, and soon enough it became synonymous with the killer. In fact, Leather Apron was the predominant pseudonym before Jack the Ripper.
Yep.
But the man identified as Leather Apron was soon cleared of all suspicion. His real name was John Picer, and he was in a different part of London on the night when Nichols was attacked.
Yep, solid alibi.
This misguided manhunt is somewhat emblematic of the whole investigation. The police pursued even the most tenuous of leads due to a lack of evidence and mounting pressure from the public.
So as the tension mounts, as the pressure mounts for them to produce a suspect, you have a much higher degree of likelihood that false leads and bad suspects are going to come about, and especially when you now have multiple police agencies involved, and you have the City of London and then the Metropolitan Police, depending on the jurisdiction, and then you've got, on top of that, folks like the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee. You've got all sorts of stuff, and it's just a recipe for tons of false leads and bad information and conflicting reports and all that kind of stuff. So it's really difficult to sift through all of it. And then now with 100+ years, 130 years almost of analyzing and overanalyzing, and people coming out with new suspects and documentaries saying, here we finally unveiled who the Ripper is. It's hard to separate fact from fiction and myth from reality, so hopefully we'll be able to do that here.
They interviewed thousands, investigated hundreds, and developed numerous theories along the way. In the words of Inspector Frederick Abeline, "Theories. We were lost almost in theories. There were so many of them."
But he had his own theory.
In an effort to narrow down the search, the police used a primitive form of criminal profiling. The idea was to analyze the available evidence to try and gauge what sort of person had committed the crimes. This profile was prepared by Dr. Thomas Bond, and he described the Ripper as a strong, middle-aged man with an inoffensive appearance who dressed respectably. Bond's most controversial assessment was that the killer possessed, quote, "no scientific nor anatomical knowledge." This stood in direct opposition to the opinions of his peers, most of whom ascribed the Ripper with at least a basic understanding of anatomy. Based on the witness accounts, the Ripper was a man of average height with a medium to stout build in his late 20s to mid-30s. He wore dark clothes, including a hat of some sort, and had a mustache. But this sort of aggregation or tabulation of accounts can be quite deceptive.
So this is really cool how he's done this here, laying it all out, because this really allows you to look at it and decide, just from looking at all this, you can figure the guy's most likely around 30 years old, because it seems like that's about where everybody's got him. Of the eyewitnesses, he's probably around 5'6", based on the averages. Think about it. If you walk past somebody on the street in the dark and caught them briefly, a glimpse of them, and didn't really even know that you were going to have to remember them until a day or two later, are you going to remember exactly how tall they are, exactly how old you think they are, and think of all the reasons why people look older or younger than they really are. So you got to kind of take that average of all of that stuff. It seems almost certain the guy had a mustache, because pretty much everybody who described facial hair describes that. The hat, the dress, things like that, the complexion.
Not only are many details inconsistent, but they could be describing entirely different people. For all we know, none of the witnesses ever laid eyes on Jack the Ripper.
But somebody
So
did.
much is up for debate that one can build a case against almost any suspect. Some have even entertained the possibility that the Ripper was a woman, or possibly a man disguised as a woman.
No chance.
While Jill or Jackie the Ripper is an interesting theory, it has failed to achieve any widespread support.
Because it's ridiculous.
What is rarely in dispute is that the Ripper was either a resident of or otherwise familiar with the East End. After all, he managed to narrowly evade capture on multiple occasions, which implies intimate knowledge of byways and patrol routes. He likely had some form of employment, as the murders were committed around weekends and public holidays, and he may have had some degree of anatomical knowledge. With this unshakable profile in hand, let's take a closer look at a few suspects.
All right.
The question is, where do we even begin?
So with the suspects, there's some that you can just rule out right away. I mean, the theory that Prince Albert Victor, who was in line for the throne, he was the son of the eldest son of the Prince of Wales, is ridiculous. He has a solid alibi. He wasn't anywhere near some of the murders. That's the whole from hell theory, which is that Albert Victor secretly wed one of these women and got her pregnant and all this stuff, and that they were ritually killing off the people involved. And even if they don't say that he was the Ripper directly, that he had like his doctor, Sir William Gull, do the murders, it's stupid and ridiculous. So ones like that you can toss out right away. There are others that you can look at and say, I don't think so, but there's no like easy provable alibi that says can't possibly be them.
According to criminal profiler and FBI Special Agent John Douglas, the Ripper was not only a local, but was likely interviewed by the police.
Agree.
If Douglas is correct, the Ripper might be someone we've already met. Either a witness or a person close to one of the victims.
And it's important, the witness thing is a strong thing, because very often the very people that are closest to one of the victims ends up, if you remember Silence of the Lambs, it's fictional obviously, but how they end up finding the killer is that they figure out that the first victim was somebody he knew, and that all the other ones kind of came after that. And so it's a very distinct possibility that the killer did know at least one of the victims.
What about John Richardson, the witness in the Chapman case who sat down on the backyard steps to trim a piece of leather from his boot?
Nope.
Richardson was indeed suspected by the police, but they found, quote, not a shred of evidence against him. His mother also lived on the premises, so he had good reason to be there. What about George Hutchinson, the witness who followed Mary Jane Kelly after she was accosted by a well-dressed client?
So I'm going to just kind of throw out on a scale from 1 to 10, 1, 0 chance he's the Ripper, and 10, absolutely the Ripper with each one of these. Hutchinson, I'd put it about a 3 or 4.
Hutchinson never clarified his motivation for shadowing the couple. He merely stated that he was surprised to see a man so well-dressed in the company of a woman like Kelly. Was he surprised because he was concerned? Was he jealous? Was it about money? After all, Hutchinson was broke, and the client appeared to be wealthy.
So I'll say this. People lie to the police for a lot of reasons that have nothing to do with them actually being involved in the crime they're being questioned about. Hutchinson's a perfect example of this. Hutchinson's definitely lying or covering something up or being misleading somehow, but I don't think he's a suspect because of that.
Perhaps he waited outside the court with the intention of mugging this well-dressed client. There are many question marks surrounding Hutchinson. He has never been positively identified, so next to nothing is known about his life. This makes it very difficult to build a strong case against him.
And this is another important thing that he brings up here, not just with the witnesses, but also with some of the victims, especially Mary Jane Kelly. They used aliases all the time, and we really don't know for sure in some of these cases. In fact, I want to say that it was Catherine Eddowes, one of the double event victims, actually went by the name Mary Ann Kelly at one time. I think, was it Catherine Eddowes? Yeah, she was the one that was arrested that night. And I believe that when she was arrested, the night she was killed, she had given the name Mary Ann Kelly as her name. So Mary Jane Kelly, for example, probably not her name for the last victim. So that makes it really difficult.
Hutchinson was interrogated by the police, but ultimately convinced Inspector Frederick Abeline that he was telling the truth. But not every witness attracted such attention from the police. Take for instance Charles Cross, the man who discovered the body of Marian Nichols.
Alright, so if we're going, and he's also known as Charles Lechmere, I think, if we're going on my scale of 1 to 10, I'd put Cross at a 7. I don't think he's the Ripper, but I think there's a strong case to be made that he could be. And there are a lot of people that will argue he was.
On the morning of August the 31st, Charles Cross left his home on Doveton Street and headed for work. When he turned into Bucks Row, he happened upon the body of Marian Nichols. Moments later, he was joined by Robert Powell, and events transpired as previously described. Despite his proximity to the crime, Cross appears to have escaped suspicion from both the press and the police. He was evidently seen as the innocent passerby that he appeared to be. But in recent years, that perception has been challenged. The argument is that Cross was in the act of committing the murder when he was interrupted by the approaching footsteps of Paul. Cross...
Plausible, but I don't think there's any evidence that's the case. Oh, I think I muted it.
The injuries inflicted upon Nichols would be consistent with an interruption, as they were less severe than those of later victims.
Yeah, but that's also easily explained by the fact that this is the first, arguably the first victim, and so he's escalating.
What's interesting about Cross is that he likely testified under a false name. He claimed to be employed as a carman, and his address was given as 22 Doveton Street. But surviving records show that in 1888, this address was occupied by a man named Charles Lechmere. Lechmere was also employed as a carman, and on at least one occasion went by the name Charles Cross, as it was the surname of his stepfather. It is now widely believed that Charles Lechmere was the man who appeared at the inquest, and that he assumed the name of his stepfather when he testified. His motivation for doing so has been the source of much speculation.
Yeah, it could be as simple as, I don't really want my name in the press and I don't want people to know it was me. It might not be anything, nefarious that he's trying to do here.
Was he trying to conceal his identity, or was it merely a force of habit? After all, contemporary examples of people doing the exact same thing are not difficult to
Billy
find.
the Kid did the same thing with his name.
The most compelling evidence against Lechmere is that his morning commute between home and work roughly coincides with the time and place of the murders.
Yeah, but that said, is he going to murder someone on the way to work? Because even if we assume, as is likely the case, that the Ripper strangles the woman to death first before he cuts them, which means there's no arterial spray, so it's much less likely he gets blood on him. Still, there's no way you avoid getting blood on yourself. So that's why I think it's got to be a butcher, and we'll get to that, because they're likely to not be seen as suspicious having blood on them. But he worked as a carman. So I don't think he would kill these women on his way to work. It just doesn't make a lot of sense to me.
Except for the murders of Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes, who were killed on a Sunday, the only day when Lechmere would have been free from work. Not only that, but all the murders were committed around weekends and public holidays. Why would a man who supposedly timed the murders with his morning commute gravitate towards days of rest? In any case, Lechmere's mother lived a few blocks south of Burner Street, the neighborhoods around which is also where Lechmere spent his childhood. As such, it's speculated that Stride and Eddowes were killed after Lechmere paid a late-night visit to his mother. While he claimed to be employed at a delivery firm known as Pickford's, there are no surviving records of his employment. If he did work for Pickford's, there is a fair chance that he delivered meat and would thus have been exposed to slaughter and blood on a daily basis. Lechmere remained in East London.
But again, that's speculation. We don't know for sure that that's what he was transporting.
Until his death in 1920 at the age of 71. While there is no evidence of Lechmere ever being suspected by the police, it is difficult to believe that he was completely overlooked. Many case files have not survived, so any doubts investigators might have had could have long since disappeared. Now, a witness who definitely attracted attention was Joseph Barnett.
And Barnett's another one that I'll give a 7 to. Barnett fits the profile. If you look at, they've done, like the modern FBI has done a profile, like, the modern profiles they do on Jack the Ripper. Barnett fits their profile. He obviously is connected to Mary Jane Kelly, which there's a lot of questions about why is Mary Jane Kelly so different. She's much younger than the other victims. She's indoors. She's just horribly brutalized. Is that only because he had more time indoors? Or is it because there was something about her, like he knew her? And that also would fit the Barnett profile. I would put Barnett slightly ahead of Lechmere on my list, but still not the one I think is the Ripper.
Joseph Barnett was the man who lived with Mary Jane Kelly up until a few days before the murder. He and Kelly had supposedly met around April of 1887, and they eventually moved to 13 Miller's Court. Barnett was employed as a fish porter, but for reasons unknown, he lost his job between July and August of 1888.
Now, some people argue that his job working with fish made it ideal for him then to be cutting up women, but there's really no comparison between cutting up a fish and cutting up a human being. You can see that comparison between a butcher, for example, who works with pigs or even cattle, but not with fish. There are other things that make him a possible suspect, though.
From that point onwards, the couple struggled to pay rent, and Kelly resorted back to prostitution. Now, those who believe that Barnett was the Ripper view his loss of employment as a turning point. The argument is that Barnett was so overcome with guilt and anguish for driving Kelly back to prostitution that he went on a murder spree, murdering one local prostitute after another in a desperate attempt to frighten Kelly off the streets. While most of this is pure speculation, it is true that Barnett disapproved of Kelly's prostitution. You may recall that Barnett separated from Kelly on October the 30th because he disliked the prostitutes with whom she associated. Kelly never went on the streets when she lived with me. She would never have gone wrong again, and I should never have left if it had not been for the prostitutes stopping by the house.
And so, of course, the other difference you have here is that Mary Jane Kelly has her own residence. It was small. It was basically a tiny room. It was really, really small. It was smaller than my closet. But it was her own residence. She wasn't staying at a common lodging house. She wasn't having to worry about nightly rent. So she did have at least that going for her.
This might further explain why Kelly was the Ripper's final and most viciously mutilated victim.
It would explain
the implication being that Burnett felt rejected by Kelly and wanted revenge for the breakup. According to Burnett, he did pay Kelly a visit on the evening of November the 8th, but they had parted on, quote, friendly terms.
Which, whether or not that was true, that's what he's going to say, right?
He then supposedly went home, played a card game until 12:30 before going to bed. Now, Kelly is presumed to have died in the early hours of November the 9th, so Burnett could have returned to Miller's Court sometime after midnight. While the police did subject him to 4 hours of interrogation, Burnett was ultimately released without charge. Then there's the matter of the locked door. When the police arrived at Miller's Court, they had to force the door open with a pickaxe. This raised an important question. How did the killer lock the door behind him? According to Burnett, the key to room 13 had been missing for some time. Because of this, he and Kelly would, quote, open the door by reaching through the broken window. The door was said to be equipped with a, quote, catch lock, and evidently locked itself upon being closed. If that's true, mystery solved.
Yep.
But even if the door was not self-locking, there's still an obvious solution. All the killer would have had to do is observe Kelly using the window trick and then employ that same technique to fasten the door upon leaving. But those who favor Burnett as the Ripper offer yet another solution. The key never went missing.
He had it the whole time.
Instead, Burnett is said to have stolen the key and then used it on the night of the murder. These solutions are all equally valid, and it's impossible to know which one is correct. There is a slight variation of this theory which states that Burnett did murder Kelly, but was not the Ripper. Instead, he merely emulated the Ripper to deflect attention away from himself.
I could buy that sooner than I could buy that he was the Ripper. You could argue that it was a different killer. I don't think it was, but it's certainly possible. And I would certainly consider that more plausible than the fact that he had killed all the other women as well.
Once again, this is pure speculation, but the murder of Kelly did somewhat differ from the rest in that it was committed indoors. Burnett remained in the East End until his death in 1926 at the age of 68. While it's only natural for suspicion to fall upon witnesses and acquaintances, Victorian detectives did pursue other lines of inquiry. One prominent theory was that the Ripper suffered from insanity, and a prime suspect in that category is Aaron Kosminski.
Now this is going to be interesting because there's not even a really... Well, let me let him describe this first, and then I'll tell you what I think is the case with this one.
The Whitechapel murders investigation was overseen by numerous high-ranking officers within the Metropolitan Police. One of them was Assistant Commissioner Robert Anderson. Upon his retirement, Anderson repeatedly and unequivocally stated that Jack the Ripper had been identified. There was no doubt whatever as to the identity of the criminal. Without disclosing the name of the suspect, Anderson described him as a, quote, low-class Polish Jew who was, quote, safely caged in an asylum. He'd been identified by a witness who was described as, quote, the only person who ever had a good view of the murderer. This unnamed witness had supposedly refused to testify because the suspect was, quote, a fellow Jew.
Yep.
I am almost tempted to disclose the identity of the murderer, but no public benefit would result from such a course.
And you'll see he also refers to knowing who wrote the Jack the Ripper letter, the Dear Boss letter. So he talked about knowing both of those things. And I will agree with this. The reason that I discount some of the other ones that are common favorites right now are that I think anybody that the police interviewed extensively and dismissed as a suspect are very unlikely to have been the suspect. Number two, I think that the Ripper was almost certainly a Polish Jew. There's a number of reasons for that. The letter being one, the From Hell letter, the eyewitness accounts, the area in which this is happening. I think he was also probably someone who worked as either a barber or as a slaughterhouse butcher of some kind. And that's kind of the direction that this one goes, but there's a catch to it.
While Anderson never revealed the name of the suspect, his colleagues were a bit more forthcoming. Chief Inspector Donald Swanson revealed that his surname was Kosminski.
But not Aaron Kosminski, just Kosminski.
Their high-ranking officer, Melville McNaughton, described Kosminski as a homicidal and misogynistic resident of Whitechapel. Surviving records show that an Aaron Kosminski was admitted to a psychiatric hospital in 1891.
Not him.
Aaron was indeed from Poland, he was Jewish, and had lived in Whitechapel. He suffered from auditory hallucinations and a paranoid fear of being fed by others. He was trained as a barber, but had, quote, not attempted any kind of work for years. It's unclear when his mental health began to decline, but upon being institutionalized, Aaron was deemed to be harmless. He was, quote, quiet and well-behaved, and, quote, apathetic as a rule. Only on rare occasions would he get, quote, excited and violent. However, before his confinement, Aaron had once threatened his sister with a knife. The case against him largely hinges upon the claims made by Anderson, Swanson, and McNaughton, especially the claim that an unnamed witness identified a suspect named Kosminski. But the descriptions of that suspect are not entirely consistent with Aaron Kosminski. For instance, McNaughton stated that the suspect had been, quote, removed to a lunatic asylum about March 1889.
Yeah, see, not
Aaron
the same
was
guy.
first confined in 1891. Swanson wrote that the suspect had been, quote, sent to the asylum and died shortly afterwards. Aaron was still alive at the time and spent nearly 3 decades in psychiatric care. As such, it is possible that the suspect Kosminski was someone other than Aaron Kosminski.
Yep.
It's also possible that these inconsistencies were mere lapses in memory. After all, these events were recounted years or even decades after the fact, and McNaughton even confessed to writing solely from memory. Regardless of the suspect's true identity, Anderson was the only one who seemed convinced of his guilt. McNaughton ultimately favored a different suspect and stated that, quote, many homicidal maniacs were suspected, but no shadow of proof could be thrown on any one.
Because there were just many homicidal maniacs living in Whitechapel at the time. Probably true.
Inspector Edmund Reed was of the same opinion. Now we have Sir Robert Anderson saying that Jack the Ripper was a Jew. That I challenge him to prove. I challenge anyone to prove that there was a tittle of evidence against man, woman, or child. So when Anderson wrote that there was, quote, no doubt whatever as to the identity of the criminal, he merely expressed his personal opinion. There was in fact ample doubt and no consensus amongst the police.
Fair.
But in recent years, Aaron Kosminski has been resurrected as a prime suspect due to a controversial DNA analysis. Okay, so back in 1888, Acting Sergeant Amos Simpson is said to have stolen a blood-stained shawl from the crime scene of Catherine Eddowes.
Which we still
the
have.
The shawl was then passed down from one generation to the next before being submitted for DNA testing in 2011.
But think about how many people have touched this thing in over 100 years. And the odds that you're going to pull from that DNA related to the killer after all this time. It's next to impossible.
DNA samples were extracted from the shawl and then compared against maternal descendants of Eddowes and Kosminski.
And what they mean by that is this. Your mitochondrial DNA, which is the Y chromosome, or the X chromosome, I'm sorry. Quick science lesson here. Males are XY, females are XX. The father determines whether or not you're a male or female by passing on either the Y chromosome or the X chromosome. The X chromosome can only be inherited through the female line, or through the male then female. It's complicated. Sum it up this way. A woman who has a daughter and a daughter and a daughter and a daughter and a daughter, you can go down 8, 9, 10 generations of daughter, mother, mother like that. That female descendant through an all-female line is going to have the same mitochondrial DNA as the woman back 10 generations. And her sons are going to have that same DNA as well, but not her son's sons. See what I mean? So if Catherine Eddowes has a daughter, they can compare that, and they can do the same with female family members of this Kosminski. It's how they figured out who Richard III's body was Richard III, because they were able to compare his mitochondrial DNA to a female line descendant of his sister who would have the same mitochondrial DNA. So anyway.
In both cases, it was a match. If the subsequent news coverage is to be believed, the mystery has now been, quote, definitively solved. Aaron Kosminski was Jack the Ripper. But as you can imagine, it's never quite that simple. First of all, the provenance or chain of custody of the shawl is severely lacking.
Yep.
There is no evidence of a shawl being found at the crime scene, nor is there any evidence of Simpson ever being at the crime scene. Furthermore, a destitute woman like Eddowes is unlikely to have owned such an expensive item.
Can we talk about, though, the fact that there were this many items found at that crime scene? I mean, I can't imagine she had all this stuff on her. Some of it was probably just laying there, but that's a ridiculously high number of things for somebody to be carrying around, including a knife, by the way.
Second of all, the type of DNA used to identify Eddowes and Kosminski was mitochondrial DNA, the powerhouse of the cell. This type of DNA is passed down through the female line and is not unique to any one individual. Thousands can share the same mitochondrial DNA, which means it can't be used to pinpoint a specific person. In the words of a geneticist, based on mitochondrial DNA, one can only exclude a suspect. So to say that the mystery has been definitively solved is widely inaccurate. There's still plenty of room for doubt. So to recap, a suspect named Kosminski was identified by an unknown witness. This was enough to convince at least one senior officer of his guilt. That suspect may have been Aaron Kosminski, a man who was largely non-violent but once threatened his sister with a knife. Aaron can neither be incriminated nor eliminated by the DNA evidence. He spent the rest of his life in psychiatric care and died in 1919 at the age of 53.
I want to dive a little deeper on this one for a minute, because I want to explore why I think this is on the right track at the very least of who the killer was. Okay, so one of the people that is listed in the suspect list is David Cohen. Now, it's important to note, and I think they mentioned this in here, that David Cohen is like John Doe. When you have a Jewish suspect in Victorian London, they would use that name in lieu of having a real name. So let me just read this to you. A 23-year-old Polish Jew who's incarceration at Colney Hatch, same place as Aaron Kosminski, on 7th December 1888, so a month after the Mary Jane Kelly murder, which I think is a vital piece of evidence, because I am convinced that Jack the Ripper either died, got put in an asylum, or was arrested on some other charge, rather than just simply stopped. I'm not saying it can't happen that way, but in this type of murder, I think it's super unlikely he just stopped. He's an unmarried tailor. He was violently antisocial, a poor East End local. He was suggested as a suspect by our author and ripperologist Martin Fido in the book Crimes, Detection, and Death of Jack the Ripper in 1987. Fido claimed the name David Cohen was used at the time to refer to a Jewish immigrant who either could not positively be identified or whose name was too difficult for police to spell. In the same fashion John Doe is used today. He identified Cohen with Leather Apron, which most people say is John Pizer, and speculated that Cohen's true identity was Nathan Kosminski. Now that's key. Kosminski, Kosminski, a bootmaker living in Whitechapel who had been treated at one time for syphilis, which would causes severe breakdowns in a person's brain in the end stages. And he obviously is in the end stages because he dies on October 1889, who could not be traced after mid-1888, the same time that Cohen appears. Fido believed the police officials confused the name Kosminski with Kosminski, resulting in the wrong man coming under suspicion. Cohen exhibited violent, destructive tendencies while at the asylum, unlike Aaron Kosminski, who did not demonstrate those kinds of things and had to be restrained. He died at the asylum on October 1889. In his book, The Cases That Haunt Us, former FBI criminal profiler John Douglas has asserted that behavioral clues gathered from the murders all point to a person, quote, known to the police as David Cohen or someone very much like him. I will say this. By the time he goes to the asylum, he's gotten violent and uncontrollable. That does not describe the man that witnesses see with these women before they died. So he either had progressively gotten worse or it's not him. Because this was a guy who looked respectable and was able to gain these women's confidence. So he could not have been crazy, so to speak. So that causes me to back off a little bit, but I think that this is kind of the right track as far as who the killer was. Whether it's exactly that person, I don't know, but I think that's the direction we probably need to look.
Kosminski was not the only suspect advanced by a high-ranking officer. A completely different suspect who still falls into the same category is Francis Tumblety.
He gets about a 4 for me. Suspect 4.
2 days before the murder of Mary Jane Kelly, an American physician named Francis Tumblety was arrested in London. As you can probably tell from this photograph, Tumblety was quite an eccentric character. He was born in Ireland around 1833, but was raised in the United States. From an early age, Tumblety gained a reputation for being a medicaster or quack doctor. He engaged in all sorts of medically dubious practices.
At one point, I think he was friends with one of the conspirators in the plot to kidnap and then eventually murder Abraham Lincoln.
And advertised himself as the Indian herb doctor. He promised to cure anything from dyspepsia and scurvy to cancer and blindness using nothing but medicinal herbs. When he was not posing as a doctor, Tumblety was busy running from the law. He was either accused or convicted for crimes like theft and assault, attempt to induce a miscarriage, and manslaughter of a patient. He was even implicated in the assassination of US President Abraham Lincoln, but was ultimately cleared of suspicion. Now, in the early 1860s, Tumblety is alleged to have hosted a lavish dinner party in Washington. Only men were invited to this dinner, and Tumblety had supposedly expressed fierce hatred of women. Furthermore, he showcased a cabinet in his office in which he stored a vast collection of jars filled with anatomical specimens, some of which were said to contain the wombs of, quote, every class of woman. In 1869, Tumblety ventured across the Atlantic and visited England for the first time. By his own admission, he roamed the streets of London until he became familiar with every part of it. He advertised himself as the Great American Doctor and had a few skirmishes with the police. After a few more voyages between the old world and the new, Tumblety found himself in London in the autumn of 1888. The purpose of his visit and whereabouts at the time of the murders are completely unknown. Tumblety never stayed in one place for long and made frequent use of false names. There is a story of a mysterious lodger leaving behind a blood-stained shirt near the murder site of Elizabeth Stride.
Now, the lodger is a fascinating what-if about all this. I'm not going to get into it, but there's something there that's pretty interesting.
This supposedly happened on the night of the murder, and some believe that this lodger was Francis Tumblety. But there is no firm evidence of that, and the entire incident is fraught with uncertainty. What we do know is that Tumblety was arrested in London on November the 7th. According to the press, as well as Tumblety himself, he was arrested on suspicion of being Jack the Ripper. 2 days later, Mary Jane Kelly was found brutally murdered, and it's unclear whether Tumblety was still in custody or had already been released on bail. You
would have to think, I'm not saying it's definite, that if he was arrested on suspicion of being the Ripper and had gotten out on bail, that somebody was watching this guy. I would like to think so.
Nevertheless, he was ultimately charged with 4 counts of gross indecency, which had nothing to do with the murders. But Tumblety had no intention of standing trial. Instead, he made his way across the English Channel, boarded a steamship under a false name, and fled back to America. He was pursued by detectives and kept under surveillance, but his offenses were, quote, not extraditable.
See, that's the thing. If they followed the man back to America, I guarantee you they were following him 2 days after he was arrested, so I just don't see it.
As such, Tomlety remained in the United States and never returned to England. So to recap, Francis Tomlety was a misogynistic medicaster who was in London at the time of the murders. He even showcased a collection of wombs, and the Ripper did indeed extract the womb from 2 of his victims. I mean, he sounds like the perfect suspect. Perhaps a bit too perfect.
Yeah, and I think that's the problem. And the other thing is that part of the argument that people make about Tomlety is based on some of the Ripper letters being genuine, because some people argue that some of the phrases in those are Americanisms, or even phrases that people of Irish descent would use. And he was born in Ireland, grew up in America, so they kind of tie him in that way. A lot of circumstantial evidence that could point in his direction, but nothing that sells me on him.
There is no doubt that Tomlety was in London in 1888, but the claim that he was a misogynistic collector of human body parts is extremely dubious. It can be traced back to a single article from December of 1888, featuring an interview with a man named Charles Dunham. Dunham had a long history of spreading misinformation and has been described as a pathological liar, a forger, and a conman. He was even convicted of perjury. As such, there is every reason to believe that this story is a complete fabrication. Furthermore,
yeah, so for me, of the suspects he's put out there right now, Kosminski, not Aaron Kosminski, but Kosminski is number 1 for me out of the ones he's mentioned. I would put Lechmere second, Barnett right below him, and then probably Tomlety after that.
Tomlety was both older and taller than the men described by most witnesses.
Way too old.
Tomlety was said to be, quote, an enormous man who liked to dress in flamboyant and militaristic outfits.
If a 55-year-old 6'2" guy was the suspect, that would have stood out to people. Absolutely.
It's difficult to imagine a tall, pompous American sneaking around the streets of Whitechapel virtually undetected.
Yeah.
On the other hand, it's unclear which, if any, of the witness accounts can be trusted.
Yeah, but none of them said that.
Then there's the matter of the rings. You may recall that 2 brass rings were stolen from the body of Annie Chapman. It's suspected that the rings were taken by the Ripper to be kept as trophies. Now, upon his death in 1903, Tomlety left behind a quite impressive estate. But among his many valuable possessions were a pair of inexpensive imitation rings. Could they have been the same rings taken from the body of Chapman? It's possible. It's also impossible to prove. Chief Inspector John Littlechild regarded Tomlety as a, quote, very likely suspect. And it's not difficult to see why. If the many rumors about him are to be believed, Tomlety had both opportunity and motive to commit the murders. But therein lies the problem. Much of what we know about Tomlety is founded upon unsubstantiated rumors. Tomlety himself was an attention-seeking charlatan with no qualms about lies and deception. With a suspect like that, one can never be certain where the lies end and the truth begins. To theorize about the identity of Jack the Ripper is to navigate a minefield of hearsay, sophistry, and contradictions. Entire encyclopedias have been dedicated to the compilation of suspects, and with every passing year, they seem to grow ever more expansive. Even though there are hundreds of potential suspects, only a dozen or so are worth more than a brief consideration.
Let's talk about James Maybrick for a second here. The first research paper I wrote on Jack the Ripper, I wrote right about the time that the book The Diary of Jack the Ripper came out. So supposedly, something along the lines, I'll try to sum it up as quickly as I can. People are doing some renovation work at a house in Liverpool in England. And in the floorboards of this house, which belonged to James Maybrick in the 1880s, who was a wealthy cotton merchant, who was often in London on weekends and around holidays, they find this diary that describes in detail the murders and what was going on between Maybrick and his wife, Florence, who was much younger than him. And in the end, he signs it. I give my name, so history do tell what love can do to a gentleman born. And he signs it Jack the Ripper. And basically, this diary purports to be James Maybrick, who is under the influence of arsenic. Now, arsenic in very small doses could be taken as a drug and have a similar effect to LSD. But the problem was that arsenic was such a powerful jolt to the system that to go off of it, the withdrawal would often kill you. And supposedly that's what happens to James Maybrick, is that he can no longer get his supply of arsenic. He dies from the withdrawal. What we know is that Maybrick's wife, Florence, who was an American, was convicted of his murder because they found the arsenic in his system. That is a historical fact. She went to jail for a couple decades, I think, until she was eventually let go. And the argument in this diary was that he wasn't poisoning her, but she was cheating on him, or that she wasn't poisoning him, she was cheating on him, and that was why Maybrick starts killing prostitutes, because he says his wife's a whore, and he's going to stick it to all the other whores. And as proof that it's true, there are two pieces of evidence that people like to point to. One of them is in the right contrast of the picture of Mary Jane Kelly's body. It looks like written in blood on the back wall are the letters FM. And in the diary, in writing about the murder of Mary Jane Kelly, who he argues he killed because she looked like his wife, and that's why she was younger and prettier than all the other victims, he says an initial here, an initial there will tell of the whoring mother, which is what he called his wife. He called her a whore for cheating on him. So he was sticking it to Mary Jane Kelly because she reminded him of his wife. And the reason he stopped killing after that is because of the arsenic withdrawal, stuff like that. So there's a lot of arguments about the diary, whether it's true or not. I should mention the other piece of evidence is that this pocket watch turns up that has the initials of the victims written into it. So like AC and, Marianne Nichols, Catherine Eddowes, Mary Jane Kelly, stuff like that. They haven't been able to disprove that the pocket watch is genuine in terms of it looks like it was those initials were carved a long time ago. So they haven't been able to prove it as a modern forgery. There's conflicting arguments about the diary, whether or not it can be proved as a modern forgery. Some tests have said, yes, it's a forgery. Others have said, if it's a forgery that dates back to that time period. I tend to believe that latter camp, which is that if it is indeed a forgery, and there's a good chance it is, it was forged at the time. The biggest problem, of course, is that Maybrick's handwriting doesn't match that in the diary. But I can't get into all of that, but it's a fascinating thing to at least look into. And that was what I wrote my research paper on, is at the time arguing that James Maybrick was Jack the Ripper. He's still kind of the intriguing suspect to me. I don't think he was Jack the Ripper, but he's the most fascinating case study for me that I still find very, very interesting. The other very common suspect people talk about is George Chapman, who was a Polish Jew who was known as Severin Kozlowski. They talk about him in the movie and the TV show Ripper Street. They show him at the end. He was convicted of poisoning several wives at the end of his life. But if he was Jack the Ripper, he completely changed his MO and lived for years without killing anybody. So I think he's unlikely, but he's another common suspect people like to point to. So anyway, let's finish this up.
Some of the more sensational contenders include famous authors and artists, as well as high-ranking officers and members of the royal family. But these grand conspiracies and elaborate deceptions seem hopelessly contrived against the sheer simplicity of a suspect like Charles Lechmere, an unassuming delivery man on his way to work. Personally, I remain unconvinced that Jack the Ripper has even been identified as a suspect. The few covered in this video are probable candidates, but it's still possible to make persuasive arguments against them. The same is true of all those left out by necessity. None of them can offer anything more than ambiguity and circumstance. With a suspect pool in the hundreds, that might seem improbable. But London was the largest city in the world, home to the largest port in the world. It was a city of millions, with a large population of poorly documented drifters. It's not difficult to imagine one lowly sailor, butcher, medic, soldier, barber, merchant.
Could easily have been in town for a couple of months, left on a ship, and disappeared into history. Absolutely possible. I still think the police had an idea and interviewed multiple times the suspect.
Blending into the slums of Whitechapel like a grain of sand.
We'll never know. Never know for sure. All right, very interesting stuff. Let me know in the comment section below, who is your suspect? Who do you think was Jack the Ripper? Fascinating stuff. And like I said, check out that other link that I threw up in there for you to check out. And we'll see you again tomorrow with some new material. Thanks for watching.